The musty smell of old books and forgotten memories filled Sarah Chen's nostrils as she stepped into the cramped estate sale office in Springfield, Missouri. October rain drummed against the windows, casting shifting shadows across boxes of photographs, documents, and personal effects that had once belonged to her late grandfather, Tommy Morrison. Sarah had driven 3 hours from Kansas City to settle the final details of Tommy's estate. At 79, her grandfather had passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a modest house and a lifetime of carefully preserved memories. She had expected the usual collection of family photographs, war memorabilia, and furniture that accumulates over 8 decades of living. "Most of the furniture sold yesterday," explained Mrs. Henderson, the elderly estate coordinator, her arthritic fingers shuffling through manila folders. "But we found this box in the basement that might interest you. Family photographs, mostly from the 40s and 50s. Sarah accepted the weathered cardboard box, feeling its surprising weight. The tape along the edges had yellowed and cracked with age. As she carefully opened it, the scent of old paper and developing chemicals escaped like a whisper from the past. Inside, dozens of black and white photographs lay nestled in tissue paper, chronicling her grandfather's youth during World War II. She found herself transported to another era as she examined each image. There was Tommy in his army uniform, barely 18 and trying to look older than his years. Another showed him with his parents outside their farmhouse, the American flag hanging proudly from the front porch. But it was a photograph near the bottom of the box that made her pause. The image showed 2 young boys around 11 years old, standing in shallow water at what appeared to be a lake. The boys were laughing, their hair tousled by wind, wearing simple swimming trunks typical of the 1940s. On the back, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, was written, "Tommy and Billy, Ozark Lake, summer 1944. Sarah smiled, recognizing her grandfather's youthful face, even in the grainy wartime photograph. Billy must have been his cousin from Arkansas, the one Tommy had mentioned occasionally in his stories about the war years. But as her eyes traced the image more carefully, something odd caught her attention. Between the 2 boys, partially obscured by the lake's gentle waves, stood a 3rd child. This boy appeared younger, maybe 9 years old, with pale skin that seemed almost luminous against the dark water. His clothing was different too, not the casual swimming attire of Tommy and Billy, but what looked like a formal white shirt and dark shorts, completely inappropriate for swimming. Sarah squinted at the photograph, bringing it closer to the dim light filtering through the office window. The 3rd child's face was turned slightly toward the camera, revealing hollow, dark eyes and an expression that seemed somehow knowing, almost melancholy. Unlike Tommy and Billy's carefree grins, this child's mouth was set in a thin, serious line. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the cluttered office. "Do you know anything about this photograph? There seem to be 3 children in it, but the writing on the back only mentions 2. The elderly woman approached, adjusting her thick glasses as she peered at the image. Her face creased into a puzzled frown. "That's strange, dear. I helped your grandfather organize many of his photographs over the years when he was preparing his war stories for the Historical Society. He always spoke of that summer at Ozark Lake as just him and his cousin Billy, never mentioned a 3rd boy." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. She studied the photograph again, noting how the mysterious 3rd child seemed to blend naturally into the scene, as if he belonged there. The lighting on his figure matched the rest of the image perfectly, and there were no obvious signs of photographic manipulation, though such techniques would have been primitive in 1944 anyway. "Could it be another cousin, maybe?" Sarah suggested, though something in her gut told her this explanation wouldn't satisfy the growing unease she felt. Mrs. Henderson shook her head slowly. "Your grandfather was quite detailed in his recollections. The Morrison and Hayes families, that would be Billy's side, were small families. During the war, with so many men overseas, every child was accounted for. There wasn't a 3rd boy in either family that age." The rain against the window seemed to intensify, and Sarah found herself staring into the dark eyes of the unknown child in the photograph. There was something unsettling about his gaze, as if he were looking not just at the camera, but directly at her, across the span of nearly 80 years. "I think I'll take this box with me today," Sarah said quietly, carefully placing the mysterious photograph back with the others. "I'd like to research this a bit more." As she signed the final paperwork and loaded the box into her car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was bringing something home with her that was better left undisturbed. The photograph seemed to radiate a strange energy, and she found herself glancing at the box in her rearview mirror during the long drive back to Kansas City, half expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. Sarah's apartment in Kansas City felt different that evening. The box of photographs sat on her dining room table like an unwelcome guest, demanding attention she wasn't sure she wanted to give. She had ordered Chinese takeout, but the food grew cold as she found herself repeatedly drawn back to the mysterious photograph from Ozark Lake. Under the bright LED lights of her modern apartment, the image seemed even more unsettling. The third child's presence was undeniable, yet everything about him felt wrong. His clothes remained completely dry despite standing in lake water, and his skin had an almost translucent quality that made him appear ethereal, ghost-like. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began researching. As a freelance journalist, she had developed strong investigative instincts, and this mystery was beginning to consume her thoughts. She started with what she knew: Ozark Lake, Missouri, summer of 1944. Her initial searches revealed that Ozark Lake was a small recreational area in the Missouri Ozarks, popular with families during the 1940s. The lake had been formed by a dam constructed in the early 1920s, flooding a small valley that had once contained a rural community. During World War II, it had served as a retreat for families dealing with the stress of having loved ones overseas. But it was a newspaper archive that provided the first disturbing clue. Buried in the Springfield Daily News from July 15, 1923, was a brief article that made Sarah's blood run cold. Local boy drowns in new lake. 9-year-old Samuel Hartwell of Cedar Ridge drowned yesterday in the newly formed Ozark Lake. The boy had been playing near the shore when he apparently waded too deep into the unfamiliar waters. His body has not been recovered despite extensive search efforts by local volunteers. Samuel was the son of Robert and Mary Hartwell, who lost their farm when the valley was flooded for the lake's construction. Sarah stared at the screen, her heart pounding. A 9-year-old boy drowned in Ozark Lake, body never recovered. The timing was wrong. This had happened in 1923, not 1944, but the age matched the mysterious child in the photograph perfectly. She printed the article and placed it beside the photograph. Looking at them together, she noticed something that made her hands tremble. The clothing described in Samuel Hartwell's school records, which she found in a genealogy database, matched exactly what the third child was wearing: a white cotton shirt and dark shorts, his Sunday best that he had been wearing when he disappeared. But how could a boy who drowned in 1923 appear in a photograph taken in 1944? Sarah tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just a coincidence, a case of pareidolia, where her mind was seeing patterns that weren't really there. Maybe the third figure was just a trick of light and shadow on the water's surface. Yet as she examined the image with a magnifying glass, she could clearly see the boy's features: the hollow cheeks, the dark hair plastered against his pale forehead, the solemn expression that seemed far too mature for a child's face. This was no optical illusion or photographic artifact. Sarah decided to call her great-uncle Billy, Tommy's cousin who would have been in the photograph. Billy Hayes was now 85 and lived in a nursing home in Little Rock, Arkansas. If anyone could shed light on this mystery, it would be him. The phone rang several times before a shaky voice answered. "Hello? Uncle Billy? This is Sarah, Tommy Morrison's granddaughter. I'm calling about some old photographs I found in Grandpa's estate." There was a long pause. "Sarah? Oh, yes, dear. I'm so sorry about Tommy. We were the last of our generation, you know, just me left now. Uncle Billy, I found a photograph from the summer of 1944 when you and Grandpa were at Ozark Lake. Do you remember that trip?" Another pause. Longer this time. When Billy spoke again, his voice had taken on a distant quality, as if he were looking back across the decades. "Ozark Lake. Yes, I remember. That was right before Tommy shipped out to the Pacific, our last summer together as boys." Uncle Billy, in the photograph, there appear to be 3 children. You, Grandpa Tommy, and another boy, younger, maybe 9 years old. Do you remember who that might have been? The silence that followed was so long that Sarah wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Billy's voice came through, barely above a whisper, and filled with something that sounded like fear. "There was no third boy, Sarah. It was just Tommy and me that day. Just the 2 of us." His breathing became labored. "Why are you asking me about this? What did you see in that photograph?" "Uncle Billy, I'm looking right at him. He's standing between you and Grandpa in the water. He's wearing a white shirt and dark shorts, and he looks like he's around 9 years old." "No." Billy's voice was sharp now, almost panicked. "No, that's not possible. There was no other child there. I would remember. We would have remembered. He paused, then added in a voice so quiet she could barely hear him, Unless it was the boy from the lake. What boy from the lake, Uncle Billy? But the line had gone dead. When Sarah tried calling back, there was no answer. Sarah barely slept that night. Billy's words echoed in her mind. The boy from the lake. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pale, solemn face of the child in the photograph, those dark eyes that seemed to follow her, even in her dreams. By morning, she had made a decision. She needed to know more about Samuel Hartwell and what had happened at Ozark Lake in 1923. Her journalist instincts told her there was a story here, something that had been buried for nearly a century. She drove to the Kansas City Public Library's genealogy section, where she spent hours combing through digitized newspaper archives, census records, and historical documents. What she discovered painted a tragic picture of a family destroyed by progress and a child lost to the waters that had swallowed his home. The Hartwell family had been among the original settlers in Cedar Ridge, a small farming community in the Missouri Ozarks. Robert Hartwell owned 40 acres of fertile valley land that had been in his family for 3 generations. But when the state decided to build a dam to create Ozark Lake for flood control and recreation, the entire valley was condemned through eminent domain. Samuel Hartwell had been born in 1914, the only child of Robert and Mary. Neighbors described him as a quiet, serious boy who loved to explore the woods and streams around his family's farm. When the evacuation notices came in early 1923, the family was forced to relocate to Springfield, leaving behind the only home Samuel had ever known. The newspaper accounts of his drowning were sparse but heartbreaking. On July 14, 1923, just weeks after the dam's completion, the Hartwell family had returned to visit their submerged homestead. Samuel had been playing along the new shoreline, while his parents dealt with the emotional trauma of seeing their farm beneath the dark water. When they called for him to come back to the car, he was nowhere to be found. The search lasted for 3 days. Volunteers dragged the lake, divers from Springfield explored the murky depths, and hundreds of people combed the shoreline. But Samuel Hartwell's body was never recovered. The lake had claimed him completely, just as it had claimed his home. What disturbed Sarah most were the witness accounts from that tragic day. Several people reported seeing Samuel walking into the water while staring at something beneath the surface, as if he were following someone or something only he could see. One witness, a local minister named Reverend Collins, wrote in his journal that the boy had seemed drawn to the water like he was going home. Sarah found more disturbing details in the Springfield Library's local history archives. In the months following Samuel's drowning, there were numerous reports of strange sightings at Ozark Lake. Fishermen claimed to see a young boy standing on the water in the early morning mist. Swimmers reported feeling something brush against their legs in the deeper sections of the lake. Park rangers documented several incidents of people becoming disoriented while swimming, claiming they heard a child's voice calling to them from underwater. By 1925, the reports had largely stopped, and Ozark Lake settled into its role as a popular recreational destination. But Sarah found scattered references to the lake boy in local folklore throughout the decades, always described as a pale child in old-fashioned clothes who appeared to visitors at the water's edge. The most chilling discovery came in a collection of personal letters donated to the Historical Society. In 1944, just weeks after Tommy and Billy's visit, a Springfield woman named Helen Rodriguez had written to her sister about a disturbing experience at Ozark Lake. We took the children for a picnic last Sunday, and the strangest thing happened. Little Maria was playing in the shallow water when she started talking to someone we couldn't see. She kept saying there was a sad boy in the water who wanted to play. When I looked where she was pointing, I swear I saw something, just for a moment, a pale shape beneath the surface. It gave me such a fright that we packed up and left immediately. Sarah sat back in her chair, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a terrifying picture. Samuel Hartwell had drowned in 1923, but somehow his presence had lingered at Ozark Lake. The sightings, the reports, the folklore, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The boy in her grandfather's photograph wasn't a living child who had been forgotten by history. He was the ghost of Samuel Hartwell, the boy who had never left the waters that had taken his life. But why had he appeared so clearly in that one photograph? And why, after decades of sporadic sightings, had he chosen to reveal himself to Tommy and Billy in 1944? Sarah gathered her research materials and headed home, her mind racing with questions. As she walked to her car in the library parking lot, she felt a sudden chill despite the warm October afternoon. For just a moment, She could have sworn she heard the sound of water lapping against an unseen shore and the faint echo of a child's voice calling from somewhere far away. That night, as she laid the photograph on her kitchen table beside her research notes, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The mysterious third child's position in the image seemed slightly different from how she remembered it. He appeared to be standing closer to Tommy and Billy, and his dark eyes seemed to be looking directly at the camera with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Sarah blinked hard and looked again, but the image remained the same. She must be imagining things, she told herself. Photographs don't change. But deep in her heart, she was beginning to suspect that the rules of the living world didn't apply to the boy from Ozark Lake. Sarah knew she needed to talk to someone who had been there that day in 1944, someone who might have seen what the camera captured. Her grandfather Tommy had passed away, and Uncle Billy seemed too frightened to discuss it further. But there was one more person who might hold the key, whoever had taken the photograph. She examined the image again with fresh eyes, noting the professional quality of the composition and lighting. This wasn't a casual snapshot taken by a family member. The angle, the depth of field, and the careful framing suggested someone with photographic experience had been behind the camera. Sarah called her mother in Denver, hoping she might remember family stories about that summer at Ozark Lake. "Mom, do you know who took the photographs of Grandpa Tommy and Billy at the lake in 1944? Her mother, Janet, paused thoughtfully. "Oh, I think that might have been Walter Kowalski. He was a friend of your great-grandfather's from the railroad. Walter had gotten interested in photography after the war started, thought he might document some of the home front activities for posterity. He had one of those fancy cameras, a Leica, I think. Is Walter still alive?" "Goodness, no. He passed away back in the 80s. But his son Michael might still be around. He lived in Springfield, last I heard. Took over his father's camera shop." Sarah's pulse quickened. A camera shop owner would have access to developing equipment and would likely have kept his father's negatives and photographs. If Walter Kowalski had taken the mysterious photograph, there might be other images from that day, possibly even negatives that could reveal more about the third child. Within an hour, Sarah had located Michael Kowalski in Springfield. At 68, he was still running Kowalski Camera and Photo, the same shop his father had opened after returning from World War II. When Sarah called and explained her research, Michael's voice became immediately interested. "Oh yes, I remember my father talking about that day at the lake. He was quite proud of those photographs, said they captured something special about wartime childhood. But there was always something that bothered him about one particular shot." "What do you mean?" "Well, when he developed the film back in 1944, he noticed something odd in one of the images. He never talked about it much, but I remember him studying that photograph for hours with a magnifying glass, muttering about exposure problems and light refraction. He kept the negative in a special envelope, separate from the others." Sarah's heart raced. "Do you still have that negative?" "I might. Dad never threw anything away, and I inherited boxes of his work when he passed. If you're serious about this research, you're welcome to come take a look. Fair warning, though. Some of Dad's old negatives are pretty deteriorated." The next morning, Sarah made the 3-hour drive back to Springfield, her mind churning with possibilities. Kowalski Camera and Photo occupied a narrow storefront on Commercial Street, its windows filled with vintage cameras and faded promotional posters from decades past. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and she was greeted by the sharp smell of developing chemicals and the sight of Michael Kowalski, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending a weathered hand. "I've been thinking about your call all night." That photograph has always been one of the mysteries in Dad's collection. He led her to the back of the shop, where file cabinets and storage boxes lined the walls. "Dad was meticulous about his record-keeping," Michael explained, pulling out a wooden box labeled 1944 Personal Work. Inside were dozens of negative sleeves, each carefully dated and catalogued. "Here it is," Michael said, holding up a translucent negative strip to the light. "July 1944, Ozark Lake." This is the image that always puzzled him. Even as a negative, the mysterious third child was clearly visible, but what caught Sarah's attention was something she hadn't noticed in the positive print. There were actually multiple exposures on the strip. Walter had taken several shots in rapid succession, documenting the boys playing in the water. "Michael, could we develop prints from all of these negatives? I'd like to see the complete sequence." "Absolutely. Dad's old darkroom is still functional. We can have prints ready in about an hour." As the images emerged in the developer solution, Sarah watched in amazement and growing horror. The sequence told a story that the single photograph had only hinted at. In the first frame, Tommy and Billy were alone in the water, laughing and splashing. In the second frame, a faint, translucent figure appeared between them, so subtle it could easily be dismissed as a trick of light. But with each successive frame, the third child became more solid, more present. By the final image in the sequence, Samuel Hartwell stood as clearly as the two living boys, his pale face turned toward the camera with those haunting dark eyes. "My God," Michael whispered, studying the prints as they hung on the drying line. "It's like he materialized out of thin air. Dad always said there was something supernatural about that shoot, but I thought he was just being dramatic." Sarah examined each print carefully. In the progression of images, she could see that Tommy and Billy seemed completely unaware of the third child's presence. They continued playing and laughing while Samuel appeared to grow more solid beside them, as if he were drawing energy from their joy and life. "Michael, did your father ever mention anything unusual happening that day? Anything that might explain this?" The older man nodded slowly. "He told me once that it was an unusually cold day for July. The air temperature was normal, but the water felt ice cold, even in the shallows, and he said the boys kept talking about how they felt like someone was watching them from under the water. Dad thought they were just being imaginative, but now—" Michael trailed off, staring at the photographs with a mixture of fascination and fear. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Dad developed these pictures the day after they were taken, but when he went to show them to the Morrison family, they claimed they had never seen the photographs before. Tommy's father insisted no pictures had been taken that day, even though Dad clearly remembered taking them." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you think that means?" "I think," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that some things aren't meant to be remembered. But sometimes the camera sees what the mind refuses to acknowledge." As Sarah prepared to leave with copies of all the photographs, Michael handed her one final item, Walter's journal from 1944. "Maybe this will help explain what really happened that day," he said. "But be careful, Sarah. Some mysteries are better left unsolved." Sarah waited until she was back in her hotel room before opening Walter Kowalski's journal. The leather-bound book was worn and weathered, its pages yellowed with age. She could smell the faint scent of old paper and ink as she carefully turned to the entries from July 1944. Walter's handwriting was precise, the careful script of a man accustomed to keeping detailed records. Most entries were mundane, notes about camera settings, weather conditions, and photographic techniques. But the entry for July 15, 1944, the day of the Ozark Lake photographs, was different. The handwriting was shaky, urgent, as if Walter had been writing quickly or under stress. "July 15, 1944, something happened today at the lake that I can't explain. I went with Frank Morrison to photograph his boy Tommy and nephew Billy for what might be their last summer together before Tommy ships out. Simple assignment. Document two boys having fun in wartime America. The day started normal enough. Clear skies, good light, perfect conditions for outdoor photography. But when we got to the lake, the atmosphere felt wrong. The water was unnaturally cold despite the July heat, and there was a stillness in the air that made my skin crawl. Even the birds seemed reluctant to fly over the water. The boys went into the lake while I set up my equipment. Through the viewfinder of my Leica, everything appeared normal, just two children playing in the shallows. But something kept drawing my attention to the space between them, as if there was movement where there should be none. I took the first shot, advanced the film, took another. With each frame I felt increasingly uneasy. The boys kept looking at each other and grinning, as if they were sharing some private joke. When I asked what was so funny, Tommy said they were playing with their new friend, but there was no one else in the water with them. I asked what friend, and Billy pointed to the empty space between them, saying the sad boy wanted to play but couldn't get warm. Frank Morrison and I exchanged glances. There was nothing there but lake water and afternoon shadows. But through my camera lens, I swear I could see something, a shimmer in the air like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but cold instead of warm. I kept shooting, driven by an instinct I couldn't explain. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with each click of the shutter. When I called for the boys to come out of the water, they seemed reluctant to leave. Tommy kept looking back over his shoulder, waving goodbye to someone we couldn't see. On the drive home, both boys fell into an unusually deep sleep, and when they woke up, they had no memory of playing with anyone else at the lake. Sarah paused in her reading, her hands trembling slightly. Walter's account confirmed what she had suspected. The boys had been interacting with Samuel Hartwell's spirit, even though they had no conscious memory of it afterward. But why had the camera been able to capture what the adults' eyes could not see? The journal entry continued. Developed the film tonight in my darkroom. What I saw in those images will haunt me for the rest of my life. In the early frames, the boys appear alone, as expected. But as the sequence progresses, another figure becomes visible. A young child, pale and translucent at first, then growing more solid with each exposure. The child appears to be around 9 years old, wearing clothing from an earlier era. His face is solemn, almost mournful, and his eyes seem to hold depths of sadness no child should carry. Most disturbing is how he seems to be drawing substance from the living children around him, becoming more real as they play. I showed the photographs to Frank Morrison the next day. He stared at them in shock, claiming he had never seen them before and insisting no pictures had been taken at the lake. When I pressed him about the third child in the images, he became agitated and accused me of playing some kind of trick. He demanded I destroy the photographs and never speak of them again. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them. They represent something important, even if I don't understand what. But I've decided to keep them separate from my other work. There's something about that third child that doesn't belong to our world, and I fear what might happen if these images were to be widely seen. I've researched the history of Ozark Lake and discovered the drowning of Samuel Hartwell in 1923. The description of the missing boy matches the child in my photographs exactly. I believe I've captured the image of a spirit, a soul that refuses to rest beneath the waters that claimed his life. God help me. I think the camera sees truth that living eyes cannot bear to witness. The journal entry ended there, but there were additional notes dated months later. December 1944. Tommy Morrison shipped out to the Pacific last week. Before he left, he came to see me, claiming he'd been having strange dreams about a boy underwater. He couldn't remember the child's face clearly, but he felt compelled to leave something at the lake, a toy soldier from his collection. Said it was for his friend who couldn't come home. March 1945. Billy Hayes visited during his leave from basic training. He asked if I had any photographs from that summer at the lake. Said he kept having the feeling he'd forgotten something important. I showed him the images, and he stared at the third child for a long time before asking, "Who is that boy? I feel like I should know him." But when I explained about Samuel Hartwell, he claimed not to remember anyone by that name. Sarah closed the journal, her mind reeling from Walter's revelations. The photographer had documented something that challenged the very nature of reality, the manifestation of a spirit so desperate for companionship that he had somehow made himself visible to both camera and children, even if the adults could not acknowledge his presence. But the most disturbing implication was that Samuel Hartwell was still there, still waiting in the dark waters of Ozark Lake. And now, nearly 80 years later, his image had found its way to Sarah. Was this mere coincidence? Or was the boy from the lake reaching out across time, seeking someone who would finally acknowledge his existence and perhaps help him find peace? As she prepared for bed in her hotel room, Sarah found herself drawn once again to the sequence of photographs Michael had printed for her. In the final image, Samuel Hartwell's eyes seemed to be looking directly at her, as if he knew she would one day see his face and understand his story. Outside her window, the October wind howled through the streets of Springfield, but Sarah could have sworn she heard something else mixed in with the sound, the gentle lapping of water against a distant shore, and the faint echo of a child's voice calling from somewhere far beneath the surface of a lake that held its secrets too close to let them go. Sarah's cell phone rang at 2:17 a.m., jarring her from restless sleep. She had been dreaming of cold water and pale faces staring up from murky depths. The caller ID showed the nursing home in Little Rock, where Uncle Billy resided. "Hello?" she answered groggily. "Sarah?" Billy's voice was barely a whisper, filled with fear and urgency. "Sarah, you have to listen to me. He's been visiting me, the boy from the lake. He won't leave me alone." Sarah sat up immediately, fully awake. "Uncle Billy, are you okay? What's happening?" "Every night since you called, he's been here, standing at the foot of my bed, dripping wet, staring at me with those dark eyes. He doesn't speak, just stands there, pointing toward the window, toward the direction of the lake." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Uncle Billy, you're in Arkansas. The lake is in Missouri. Distance doesn't matter to him, Sarah. He's not bound by the same rules we are. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, he spoke." "What did he say?" Billy's breathing became labored, and Sarah could hear the fear in his voice. "He said his name, Samuel, And then he said something that chilled me to the bone. He said, "She has my picture. She can help me go home." Sarah's hands began to tremble. The photograph was sitting on the nightstand beside her bed, seeming to pulse with malevolent energy in the darkness of the hotel room. "Uncle Billy, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that day at the lake. Everything, even if it seems impossible." There was a long pause before Billy began speaking, his voice distant and haunted. "We knew he was there, Sarah. Tommy and I, we both knew. But it was like our minds couldn't hold on to the knowledge. Every time we tried to focus on him, the memory would slip away like water through our fingers. But you played with him." "Yes. He taught us games that children had played in the lake before it was a lake, when it was just Cedar Ridge Valley. Hide and seek among the submerged trees, tag in the shallows where the old schoolhouse used to be. He knew every inch of that underwater world because he'd been exploring it alone for 21 years. Billy's voice broke with emotion. "He was so lonely, Sarah, so desperately lonely. He'd been waiting down there in the dark, watching families come and go, children playing above while he remained trapped below. When he saw Tommy and me that day, 2 boys close to his age, he couldn't resist trying to join us. How was he able to manifest so clearly? I think it was the combination of our youth and innocence, and the fact that we were playing in the water where he died. Children are more open to seeing things adults dismiss. And water holds memory, Sarah. It remembers everything that's ever touched it." Sarah thought about Walter's photographs, how Samuel had grown more solid with each frame. "Uncle Billy, why do you think we can't remember him clearly?" "Because the adult mind protects itself from things it can't understand. When we got older, our memories of him faded, became like half-remembered dreams. But he never forgot us. All these years, he's been waiting for someone to acknowledge him, to help him find peace. What does he want from me?" Billy's voice became urgent. "He wants you to come to the lake, Sarah. He wants you to see where he died, where his body still rests in the ruins of his family's farm. He's been trapped there for nearly a century, unable to move on because no one ever properly mourned him. His body was never found, never buried, never blessed. But why me specifically? Because you're the first person to see his photograph and believe in him instead of dismissing him as a trick of light or imagination. You've researched his story, learned his name, acknowledged his existence. In doing so, you've formed a connection with him." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hotel's air conditioning. "Uncle Billy, I'm scared. What if going to the lake makes things worse? I don't think you have a choice anymore, dear. He's growing stronger, more desperate. Tonight, when he appeared to me, the water from his clothes soaked into my bedsheets. The nurses found puddles on the floor with no explanation. He's starting to affect the physical world, and that's dangerous for everyone. What do you think I should do when I get there?" Billy was quiet for a long moment. "Find where his family's farm was located beneath the lake. The records should show the exact location. Go there at dawn, when the boundary between worlds is thinnest. Acknowledge his death, speak his name, and help him understand that it's time to let go." "Will that work?" "I don't know, Sarah, but I think it's his only chance for peace and our only chance for him to stop haunting the living." The line went quiet, except for Billy's labored breathing. Finally, he spoke again. "Sarah, be very careful. Spirits that have lingered as long as Samuel can become dangerous when they're desperate. He's been alone in those dark waters for 8 decades. That kind of isolation can twist a soul, even an innocent one." "I understand, Uncle Billy." "And Sarah, if something happens to me before you reach the lake, know that I've finally remembered him clearly. His face, his voice, the games we played. The memory is beautiful and terrible at the same time." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her hotel room, staring at the photograph on her nightstand. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, Samuel Hartwell's eyes seemed to gleam with anticipation. She had the unsettling feeling that he knew she would come to the lake, that everything had been leading to this moment from the instant she first laid eyes on his image. Outside her window, storm clouds were gathering over Springfield, and in the distance she could hear the rumble of thunder. But beneath that natural sound she could have sworn she detected something else, the gentle splash of a child playing alone in dark water, calling out for friends who would never come to join him in his endless solitary game. Sarah arrived at Ozark Lake just as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the Missouri sky. The drive from Springfield had taken an hour through winding country roads that seemed to grow narrower and more isolated with each mile. Storm clouds from the previous night still lingered overhead, casting the landscape in an eerie twilight despite the approaching sunrise. The lake looked nothing like the cheerful recreational area from her grandfather's stories. Decades of neglect had taken their toll. The old boat ramps were crumbling, the picnic areas overgrown with weeds and brambles. A rusted sign proclaimed Ozark Lake State Recreation Area, but it was clear that few people visited this remote corner of the Missouri Ozarks anymore. Sarah parked her car near what had once been the main beach area and gathered her research materials. She had spent hours the previous evening studying county records and old survey maps to determine the approximate location of the Hartwell farm beneath the lake's dark surface. According to her calculations, the family's homestead lay about 200 yards from the current shoreline, in what would have been a fertile valley bottom before the dam was built. The morning air was unnaturally cold for October, and mist rose from the lake's surface like ghostly fingers reaching toward the overcast sky. As Sarah walked along the overgrown shoreline, she could hear the gentle lapping of water against the rocky bank, but there were no other sounds, no birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. The silence was complete and oppressive. She found what appeared to be the best vantage point for her intended destination, a small promontory that jutted out into the lake, bringing her as close as possible to where the Hartwell farm would have stood. According to the old property maps, this spot would have overlooked the family's farmhouse and the small stream where young Samuel had loved to play before the valley was flooded. Sarah set up her camera equipment, more out of nervous habit than any real plan to document what might happen. As a journalist, she felt more confident with her tools around her, even in a situation that defied all logic and reason. The sun was now visible through the clouds, casting long shadows across the water's surface. Sarah took a deep breath and spoke Samuel's name aloud for the first time. "Samuel Hartwell, I know you're here. I know you've been waiting." The words seemed to hang in the still air, and Sarah felt a sudden drop in temperature that made her breath visible in small puffs of vapor. The mist above the lake began to swirl and coalesce, forming shapes that almost resembled human figures before dissolving back into formless vapor. "I've seen your photograph, Samuel. I know what happened to you in 1923. I know about your family's farm that lies beneath these waters." As she spoke, the lake's surface began to change. The gentle lapping against the shore grew more insistent, and small waves appeared despite the complete absence of wind. In the distance, Sarah could see a disturbance in the water, as if something large was moving just beneath the surface. "My grandfather Tommy and his cousin Billy played with you that summer in 1944. They remember you now, Samuel. You're not forgotten." The disturbance in the water grew larger, moving closer to shore. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched what appeared to be a column of water rising from the lake's surface, taking on a vaguely human shape. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began to form on the rocks around her feet. "I want to help you, Samuel. I want to help you find peace." Suddenly, the watery figure collapsed back into the lake with a tremendous splash, sending waves crashing against the shoreline with surprising force. Sarah stumbled backward, her equipment nearly toppling over as cold lake water soaked her shoes and the hem of her jeans. But it was what she saw in the receding waves that made her gasp in terror and wonder. There, revealed in the shallow water near the shore, were the rotted timbers of what appeared to be a building's foundation. The dropping water level had exposed part of the lake bottom, and Sarah realized she was looking at the remains of the Hartwell farmhouse, preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor environment of the lake's depths. Among the timbers, something gleamed in the morning light. Sarah waded into the frigid water, her legs going numb almost instantly, and reached down to retrieve what appeared to be a child's toy, a small metal soldier, green paint still visible on its tiny uniform despite decades. Underwater, as her fingers closed around the toy soldier, Sarah heard it. A child's voice, clear and distinct, carried on the still morning air. "Thank you for remembering me." She spun around, searching the shoreline, but saw nothing except mist and shadow. The voice came again, closer this time. "I've been waiting so long for someone to say my name, to know my story." The temperature plummeted further, and Sarah's breath now came in great white plumes. Ice began to form at the lake's edge, spreading outward in crystalline patterns that defied the October weather. "Samuel," she called out, her voice echoing across the water. "Where are you?" "I'm here," came the reply, and suddenly he was standing waist-deep in the lake, exactly as he appeared in the 1944 photograph, pale skin, dark hair plastered to his skull, wearing the white shirt and dark shorts he had drowned in nearly a century ago. His dark eyes held the same mournful expression, but now there was something else. Hope. Sarah's camera automatically began clicking as her trained reflexes took over, documenting this impossible encounter. Samuel didn't disappear as she might have expected. Instead, he began walking toward her through the water, his movements creating no ripples on the lake's now still surface. "You found my home," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water, despite the distance between them. "You found where I used to live, where I used to play." "Yes," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice catching in her throat. "I found your family's farm, Samuel. I know about the valley that was flooded, about how you lost your home." Samuel stopped about 10 feet from shore, and Sarah could see that his form was becoming more solid, more present, with each passing moment. The toy soldier in her hand grew ice cold, so cold it almost burned her fingers. "Tommy left that for me," Samuel said, gesturing to the metal figure. "After the war he came back and threw it in the water. He said it was for his friend who couldn't come home. He remembered me then, at least a little." Sarah felt tears freezing on her cheeks as the full tragedy of Samuel's situation became clear. He had been trapped for decades, occasionally glimpsed, but never truly acknowledged, watching the world change above while he remained frozen in the moment of his death. "What do you need from me, Samuel?" she asked. "How can I help you find peace?" Samuel's ghostly form shimmered in the morning light as he stood motionless in the lake's shallows. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 8 decades of solitude. "I need to tell someone what really happened that day," he said, his dark eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Everyone thinks I just wandered into the water and drowned, but that's not the truth." Sarah gripped her camera tighter, using its familiar weight to anchor herself to reality, as she witnessed something that should have been impossible. "Tell me, Samuel. I'm listening." The boy's form seemed to grow more solid as he began his tale, as if the act of finally sharing his story was giving him strength. "When they built the dam and flooded our valley, they didn't just take our home. They took everything that made me who I was. The creek where I caught fireflies, the oak tree where I built my fort, the field where I helped Papa plant corn. All of it disappeared under the water." The lake around Samuel began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence, and Sarah could see shapes moving beneath the surface, the ghostly outlines of buildings, fences, and trees from the submerged community of Cedar Ridge. "Mama and Papa tried to make a new life in Springfield, but I couldn't forget what we'd lost. Every night I dreamed about our farm, about swimming in Miller's Creek, about the way the sunlight used to filter through the trees behind our house. When they brought me back to see the lake that first time, I wasn't planning to die. I was planning to go home." Sarah felt her throat constrict with emotion as she realized the true tragedy of Samuel's death. He hadn't simply drowned. He had chosen to return to the only place he had ever felt he belonged, even though that place now existed only underwater. "I walked into the lake because I could see them," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. "All the things that used to be there, preserved somehow in the dark water. Our house was still standing, just like it had always been. The apple tree Mama planted when I was born was still blooming. I could see my dog Rex running around the yard barking at butterflies." The phosphorescent glow beneath the water intensified, and Sarah gasped as she caught glimpses of what Samuel was describing, shadowy impressions of a life that had been drowned, but not destroyed, existing in some liminal space between memory and reality. "I thought I could just swim down and open our front door, walk into our kitchen where Mama would be making biscuits for breakfast. I thought I could be 9 years old again, playing in a world that made sense." Samuel's form began to flicker, as if the emotion of reliving his death was weakening his ability to manifest. "But when the cold water closed over my head, I realized my mistake. I was still alive, but everything I was trying to reach was already dead. I tried to swim back to the surface, but I was too far down, and the weight of all that lost history was pulling me deeper." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, understanding now why Samuel had appeared to her grandfather and Billy. "You were looking for friends, for other children who might understand. When Tommy and Billy came to the lake that day in 1944, they were the first children I had seen who played the way I used to play. They had imagination, wonder, the ability to see magic in ordinary things. For a few precious hours, I wasn't alone anymore." The toy soldier in Sarah's hand grew even colder, and she realized it was serving as a conduit, allowing Samuel to draw energy from her world to maintain his manifestation. "Why couldn't they remember you afterward?" Samuel's expression grew sad. "Because I was greedy. I wanted so badly to feel alive again that I took too much from them. I absorbed some of their life energy to make myself solid, and in doing so, I also absorbed some of their memories of me. They forgot because I stole their remembrance to feed my own existence." Sarah began to understand the true horror of Samuel's situation. He had been trapped in a cycle of loneliness and desperate connection, unable to find peace because each encounter with the living required him to take something from them. But you remember them clearly. Every detail. Tommy's laugh when he discovered he could skip stones. Billy's concentration when he tried to catch minnows with his bare hands. The way they both looked when they talked about the war, trying to sound grown up but still being children at heart. I treasure those memories because they're the only real happiness I've experienced in 80 years. The lake's surface began to ripple, despite the absence of wind, and Sarah noticed that other figures were becoming visible in the water, translucent forms of adults and children, all wearing clothes from different eras. She realized she was seeing the ghosts of everyone who had ever drowned in Ozark Lake, drawn to Samuel's manifestation like moths to a flame. Samuel, are there others like you here? The boy nodded solemnly. The lake remembers everyone it has claimed, but most of them have found peace, moved on to whatever comes next. I'm the only one who refused to let go, who insisted on clinging to what was lost. Why are you showing yourself to me now? What's changed? Samuel's form began to grow more translucent, and Sarah could see that maintaining this level of manifestation was exhausting him. Because you're the first person to seek out my story, instead of just stumbling upon it. You came here not by accident or for recreation, but because you wanted to understand who I was and what happened to me. That intention, that deliberate act of remembrance, gives me the strength to speak. The other ghostly figures in the lake were becoming more agitated, swirling around Samuel like a supernatural whirlpool. Sarah realized that her presence was disturbing the delicate balance that had existed in this place for decades. Samuel, I think you're frightening the other spirits. They seem upset. The boy looked around at his spectral companions and nodded. They know that my time here is almost over. They're afraid of being alone again when I finally let go. Is that what you want to do? Let go. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting depths of sadness that no child should ever have to carry. I think I'm ready now. For 80 years, I've been trying to return to a home that no longer exists, but talking to you, telling my story to someone who cares enough to listen, I think I understand now that home isn't a place you can go back to. It's something you carry with you. The phosphorescent glow beneath the water began to fade, and the other spirits grew calm, as if Samuel's approaching peace was bringing them comfort as well. But Sarah could sense that the process of letting go wouldn't be simple or easy. Samuel had been anchored to this lake for so long that breaking free would require tremendous effort and courage. What do you need me to do, Samuel? The boy's form was becoming increasingly transparent, but his voice remained clear and strong. Help me remember not just what I lost, but what I was given. Help me see that 9 years of life, even cut short, was still a gift worth celebrating. Sarah understood what Samuel was asking of her. For 8 decades, he had focused only on what death had stolen from him. But to find peace, he needed to remember what life had given him. She set down her camera and waded deeper into the frigid water, ignoring the shock of cold that shot through her legs. Tell me about your life before the lake, Samuel. Tell me about the good times. The boy's ghostly form brightened slightly, as if her request was feeding him energy instead of draining it. I was born in the springtime of 1914, when the apple trees were blooming all through Cedar Ridge Valley. Mama said I came into the world laughing, and Papa claimed that was why the harvest that year was the best they'd ever had. As Samuel spoke, the water around them began to clear, and Sarah could see deeper into the lake's depths. The ruins of the submerged community were becoming more distinct, no longer just shadows, but recognizable structures preserved in the cold, dark water. Our farmhouse had a big front porch where we'd sit in the evenings, watching fireflies dance over Miller's Creek. Mama would shell peas, while Papa told stories about his grandfather, who'd fought in the Civil War. I had a tire swing hanging from the old oak tree, and I could swing so high I felt like I was flying. The lake's surface began to glow again, but this time, the light was warm and golden, like summer sunshine filtering through water. Sarah realized that as Samuel focused on positive memories, the entire spiritual atmosphere of the lake was changing. I had a dog named Rex, a yellow mutt, who followed me everywhere. He used to chase rabbits through the cornfield, never catching them but having the time of his life trying. In winter, we'd slide down the hill behind our house on an old piece of tin roofing, Rex barking and running alongside us. The toy soldier in Sarah's hand was growing warmer, and she could feel it pulsing gently as if it had developed a heartbeat. Around them, the other spirits in the lake were becoming more visible, but instead of appearing agitated, they seemed peaceful, drawn to Samuel's memories of joy. "Tell me about your friends, Samuel. Tell me about playing with other children." The boy's smile was the first truly happy expression Sarah had seen from him. There was Mary Elizabeth Turner, who lived on the next farm over. She had red pigtails and could climb trees better than any of the boys. We used to build mud pies down by the creek and pretend we were running a fancy restaurant. The water around Sarah's feet was now comfortably warm, and she could see small, luminous fish swimming between the submerged ruins. The lake was responding to Samuel's shift in perspective, transforming from a place of loss to a place of cherished memory. And Johnny Morse, who taught me how to whistle through my fingers and catch lightning bugs in mason jars. We'd spend whole afternoons building forts out of fallen branches, defending our territory against imaginary armies. "What about your parents, Samuel? What do you remember about them?" Samuel's form became more solid as he spoke about his family. Papa had the strongest hands in the county. He could split logs with a single swing of his axe, but he was so gentle when he helped me learn to read. He'd sit with me on the front porch steps, pointing out letters in his old Bible, teaching me how words could hold magic. And Mama was the best cook in 3 counties. She could make anything taste good, even turnips, which I hated, but her apple pies were legendary. People would come from miles around when word got out that Mama was baking. She'd always save me the biggest piece, with extra cinnamon. As Samuel continued sharing his memories, Sarah noticed that the submerged ruins of Cedar Ridge were beginning to look less like a drowned cemetery and more like a preserved monument to a way of life that had been lost but not forgotten. The buildings were still there underwater, but they no longer seemed tragic. They seemed eternal, protected by the lake's embrace. "Samuel, do you remember your last good day? The last perfect day before everything changed?" The boy thought for a moment, his expression growing thoughtful. "It was the day before the evacuation notice came. Papa and I went fishing at dawn, just the 2 of us. We didn't catch much, but we talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his plans for expanding the farm, about the college education he was saving money to give me. Mama made us a lunch to take along, thick sandwiches with ham from our own smokehouse and tomatoes from her garden. We ate sitting on the bank of Miller's Creek, our feet dangling in the water, watching the minnows dart between our toes. The golden glow in the water intensified, and Sarah realized that other figures were becoming visible around them, not ghosts, but memories made manifest. She could see a tall man with work-worn hands sitting beside a younger Samuel, both of them laughing at something only they understood. That afternoon, Mama let me help her in the garden. We picked beans and squash, and she taught me how to tell when a tomato was perfectly ripe. She said a good farmer had to understand the rhythm of growing things, had to know when to plant and when to harvest, and when to let the earth rest. That evening, we all sat on the porch while Papa played his harmonica. Mama sang along in her clear, sweet voice, and I tried to harmonize even though I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Rex lay at my feet, and the whole world felt perfect and safe and permanent. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed this act of spiritual healing. Samuel was no longer the lonely, desperate ghost who had been haunting Ozark Lake for 8 decades. He was becoming again the happy child he had been, remembering not what death had taken, but what life had given. "Samuel, do you understand now? You weren't just the boy who drowned. You were the boy who lived. You were loved, and you loved others. And that love doesn't disappear just because your body did." The ghostly form of Samuel Hartwell began to glow with warm, internal light. Around them, the lake had transformed completely. No longer a place of tragedy, but a sanctuary where precious memories were preserved forever. The other spirits in the water were smiling, finally at peace in the presence of Samuel's joy. "I remember now," Samuel said, his voice filled with wonder. "I remember that I was happy. I remember that my life mattered, even though it was short." But as Sarah watched the boy's form beginning to fade, she realized that this moment of peace was only the beginning of his journey toward final rest. The hardest part was still to come, letting go of his need to cling to the physical world and trusting that love transcends death. As the golden light around Samuel grew brighter, Sarah sensed a shift in the spiritual atmosphere of the lake. The other ghostly presences that had been drawn to their conversation were beginning to fade, not disappearing but rather settling into peaceful rest. Samuel's healing was affecting the entire supernatural ecosystem of Ozark Lake, but the boy himself seemed hesitant, his form flickering between solid and translucent as if he were struggling with an internal conflict. "Samuel, what's wrong?" Sarah asked gently. "You remember the love now. You remember the joy. What's holding you back?" The ghostly child looked around at the submerged ruins of his hometown, his expression torn between longing and fear. If I let go, if I move on to whatever comes next, will I lose these memories? Will I forget Mama's apple pies and Papa's harmonica and the feeling of Rex's fur under my fingers? Sarah waded closer to Samuel, close enough now that she could see the individual droplets of lake water that clung to his ethereal form. I don't think love ever truly disappears, Samuel. I think it becomes part of something bigger, something eternal. But how can you be sure? The boy's voice was small, frightened. I've spent 80 years holding on to these memories because they're all I have left of who I was. If I release them, what if there's nothing on the other side? Sarah thought about her grandfather Tommy, about Uncle Billy, about all the people who had been touched by Samuel's story across the decades. Samuel, look at what your existence has already created. My grandfather never forgot you completely. Uncle Billy carried your memory in his heart for his entire life. Walter Kowalski preserved your image because he knew it was important. And now I'm here, telling your story, making sure you're remembered. The toy soldier in Sarah's hand was now pulsing with warm light, and she held it out toward Samuel. This little soldier that my grandfather left for you, it wasn't just a gift. It was a promise that you wouldn't be forgotten, that your friendship mattered to him, even if he couldn't consciously remember why. Samuel reached out with a translucent hand to touch the metal figure, and when his fingers made contact, both the toy and the boy blazed with brilliant light. In that illumination, Sarah saw something that took her breath away. Standing behind Samuel were two adult figures, a man and woman in 1920s clothing, their faces filled with love and infinite patience. "Mama? Papa?" Samuel whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. The woman stepped forward, her form becoming more distinct as Samuel acknowledged her presence. She was petite, with kind eyes and graying hair pinned up in the fashion of the era. "We've been waiting for you, Samuel. We've been waiting so long." The man moved to stand beside his wife, tall and weathered with the calloused hands Sarah remembered from Samuel's memories. "Son, it's time to come home. The real home, not the one under the water." Samuel turned back to Sarah, and she could see the struggle in his dark eyes. "But what about the lake? What about all the memories preserved here? If I leave, who will guard them?" Sarah felt a profound understanding wash over her. "The memories don't need guarding, Samuel. They need sharing. They need to be part of the living world, not trapped beneath it." She pulled out her camera and showed Samuel the images she had captured during their conversation. In the digital display, she could see not just Samuel's ghostly form, but glimpses of the life he had described, shadows of a farmhouse, the outline of a tire swing, the suggestion of a yellow dog running through tall grass. "I'm a journalist, Samuel. Telling stories is what I do. Your story, your family's story, the story of Cedar Ridge and all the people who lived there. These memories won't be lost. They'll be shared with the world. They'll become part of history instead of being hidden beneath the water." Samuel's parents moved closer, and Sarah could feel the overwhelming love that flowed between the family. The boy looked from his parents to Sarah to the toy soldier in her hand, and she could see him weighing his choice between clinging to the past and trusting in an unknown future. "Will you really tell people about Cedar Ridge?" he asked. "About the community that was drowned to make this lake?" "I promise," Sarah said solemnly. "I'll write about the families who lost their homes, about the children who lost their playgrounds, about the way of life that disappeared beneath these waters. Your story will help people understand what was sacrificed to build this lake." Samuel's father extended his hand toward his son. "The choice is yours, Samuel. You can stay here with your memories, or you can come with us and discover what lies beyond memory." The boy looked around one last time at the underwater ruins of his hometown. The golden light that had transformed the lake was beginning to fade, but instead of returning to its previous dark and forbidding appearance, the water now seemed peaceful, natural. The ghosts and spirits that had haunted its depths were gone, finally, at rest. "I want to go with you," Samuel said finally, his voice strong and sure. "I want to find out what comes after the end of the story." As he spoke these words, Samuel's form began to change. The pale, mournful ghost who had haunted Ozark Lake for 8 decades faded away, replaced by the image of a healthy, happy 9-year-old boy with bright eyes and a genuine smile. This was Samuel as he was meant to be, not defined by his death, but by his life. The boy reached out and grasped his father's hand, then his mother's. As the three figures began to fade, growing translucent and ethereal, Samuel called out to Sarah one last time, "Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for helping me remember who I was before I became who I feared I'd always be. The golden light flared one final time, so bright that Sarah had to close her eyes. When the radiance faded and she opened them again, she was alone on the shore of Ozark Lake. The water was calm and clear, reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. The oppressive atmosphere of supernatural dread was completely gone, replaced by the peaceful quiet of a natural lake in autumn. In her hand, the toy soldier had returned to normal temperature, just a simple piece of painted metal with no otherworldly properties. But as Sarah looked at it, she could swear she heard the faint echo of a child's laughter carried on the morning breeze, joyful and free and finally at peace. 3 weeks after her encounter at Ozark Lake, Sarah sat in her Kansas City apartment, staring at her computer screen. The cursor blinked patiently at the end of a sentence that had taken her hours to write. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you tell a story that defies every rule of journalism she had ever learned? Her editor at the Kansas City Star had been intrigued when she pitched the historical piece about Cedar Ridge and the communities lost to dam construction in Missouri. It was exactly the kind of human interest story that readers loved, the forgotten cost of progress, the families displaced by development projects. But Sarah knew she couldn't tell the real story, couldn't write about ghosts and supernatural encounters in a mainstream newspaper. Instead, she had crafted a carefully researched piece about the Hartwell family and the other residents of Cedar Ridge who had lost their homes when Ozark Lake was created. She interviewed descendants of the displaced families, researched property records, and painted a vivid picture of rural life in the Missouri Ozarks during the early 1920s. The article had run on the front page of the Sunday edition, complete with historical photographs and maps showing the submerged community. The response from readers had been overwhelming. Dozens of emails from people sharing their own family stories about lost homesteads and forgotten communities throughout Missouri. But it was the phone call from Uncle Billy that had meant the most to Sarah. "I read your article about Cedar Ridge," he had said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "For the first time in decades, I slept through the night without dreams of dark water. I think our friend has finally found peace." Sarah had also heard from the nursing staff at Billy's facility. His nighttime episodes had stopped completely. The mysterious puddles of water that had appeared in his room were gone. Whatever supernatural connection had existed between Billy and Samuel Hartwell had been severed when the boy finally moved on. Now Sarah faced a different challenge. She had promised Samuel she would preserve his story, but how could she share the truth of what had happened at the lake? Who would believe that she had conversed with an 80-year-old ghost and witnessed his spiritual healing? The answer came from an unexpected source. Michael Kowalski from the camera shop in Springfield had called with an intriguing proposal. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he had said. "My father's photographs and journal entries about that day in 1944, they're historically significant, regardless of how you interpret them. I think there's a book in this story, Sarah, not just about Samuel Hartwell, but about the nature of memory, the way photography preserves moments that the mind chooses to forget." The idea had excited Sarah immediately. A book would allow her to explore the mystery without having to provide definitive answers. She could present the facts, the photographs, the historical research, and let readers draw their own conclusions about what had really happened at Ozark Lake. She was deep in thought about the book's structure when her doorbell rang. Sarah found a delivery driver on her doorstep with a package addressed to her. No return address, just her name and apartment number in spidery handwriting. Inside the box, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was another photograph. This one was older than the 1944 image, printed on thick paper with the sepia tones typical of the 1920s. It showed a family of 3 standing in front of a modest farmhouse, a tall man with calloused hands, a petite woman with kind eyes, and a young boy with a bright smile and mischievous expression. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Robert, Mary, and Samuel Hartwell, Cedar Ridge Farm, Spring 1923. Sarah stared at the photograph in amazement. This was Samuel as he had been in life, not the pale, mournful ghost she had encountered, but a happy, healthy child surrounded by parents who loved him deeply. The image radiated warmth and life, a stark contrast to the supernatural photographs from 1944. There was no note explaining how the photograph had found its way to her, no indication of who had sent it, but Sarah understood the message. Samuel's story was meant to be told, and somehow the universe was providing her with the tools she needed to tell it properly. That evening, she called her literary agent in New York. "I have an idea for a book," she began. "It's about a photograph, a mystery that spans 8 decades, and the power of memory to both haunt and heal. But fair warning, it's not going to fit neatly into any category. It's part historical research, part family memoir, part supernatural mystery." "Sounds fascinating," her agent replied. "What's your hook? What makes this story unique?" Sarah looked at the 2 photographs spread out on her dining room table, Samuel as he lived, and Samuel as he had lingered after death. Between them lay the toy soldier her grandfather had left at the lake, now just a simple childhood memento with no otherworldly properties. "The hook is that some stories are too important to stay buried," she said finally. "And sometimes the dead have something to teach the living about what it really means to be alive." 3 months later, Sarah's book proposal had been accepted by a major publisher. The advance was substantial enough to allow her to take a leave of absence from the newspaper and focus entirely on research and writing. Her first stop was the Missouri State Archives, where she planned to dig deeper into the history of dam construction and community displacement throughout the state. But it was also where she made a discovery that confirmed her belief that Samuel's story needed to be told. In a box of uncatalogued documents from the 1920s, she found a letter from Robert Hartwell to the state governor, written shortly after his son's death. The letter was a passionate plea for better safety measures at recreational lakes, for warning signs about underwater hazards, for recognition that the new lakes created by dam projects posed unique dangers to children unfamiliar with deep water. "My son Samuel died because we didn't understand the risks," Robert had written in his careful handwriting. "He grew up playing in shallow creeks and streams, never learning to respect the power of deep water. If his death can prevent other families from suffering this loss, then perhaps some good can come from our tragedy." Sarah realized that Samuel's story wasn't just about one boy's supernatural inability to let go of life. It was about the broader human cost of progress, the way communities and families were reshaped by forces beyond their control, and the resilience required to build new lives after losing everything familiar. As she continued her research, Sarah began to understand that Cedar Ridge was just one of dozens of communities that had been submerged beneath Missouri's lakes. Each had its own stories, its own lost families, its own Samuel Hartwells, whose voices had been silenced by rising water. The book she was writing would give voice to all of them, using Samuel's story as a lens through which to examine the complex relationship between memory, loss, and the American pursuit of progress. It would be a story about the seen and unseen costs of the dams and lakes that had reshaped the Missouri landscape throughout the 20th century. 1 year later, Sarah stood once again on the shores of Ozark Lake, but this time she was not alone. A small crowd had gathered for the dedication ceremony, descendants of Cedar Ridge families, local historians, state park officials, and readers who had been moved by her book, The Boy Beneath the Water, Lost Communities of Missouri's Lakes. The book had been published 6 months earlier to critical acclaim and surprising commercial success. Sarah had managed to walk the delicate line between historical documentation and supernatural mystery, allowing readers to interpret the strange events surrounding the 1944 photograph according to their own beliefs, while never diminishing the very real human tragedy at the story's heart. Most importantly, the book had accomplished what Samuel had asked of her. It had ensured that Cedar Ridge and its residents were remembered. The Missouri Historical Society had created a permanent exhibit about submerged communities, and the state had begun a project to document and preserve the stories of all the families displaced by dam construction throughout the 20th century. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Dr. Margaret Reynolds, director of the Missouri State Park System, "we are gathered here today to dedicate this memorial to the families and communities that lie beneath Ozark Lake. Thanks to the research and advocacy of journalist Sarah Chen, we are finally acknowledging the human cost of progress." Sarah watched as the cloth covering was removed from the bronze plaque mounted on a granite stone. The memorial was simple but elegant, bearing the names of all the families who had lived in Cedar Ridge before the valley was flooded. At the top of the list, in letters that caught the afternoon sunlight, was inscribed, "Samuel Hartwell, 1914-1923, beloved son of Robert and Mary." As the crowd read the names aloud, Sarah felt a familiar warmth in her jacket pocket. She reached in and touched the toy soldier that she now carried everywhere, not because it held any supernatural power, but because it reminded her of the importance of bearing witness to stories that might otherwise be forgotten. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained by the memorial. The lake was peaceful in the golden hour before sunset, its surface reflecting the changing leaves of the surrounding oak and maple trees. There was no trace of the supernatural atmosphere that had once made this place feel haunted and unwelcoming. Ms. Chen. Sarah turned to see an elderly woman approaching, walking carefully with the aid of a cane. She appeared to be in her 80s, with silver hair and bright blue eyes that held a spark of intelligence and something else, recognition. "Yes, I'm Sarah Chen." The woman extended a weathered hand. "I'm Dorothy Hartwell Martinez. Samuel was my great-uncle." Sarah felt her breath catch. "I had no idea any of Samuel's family was still alive." Dorothy smiled. The Hartwell line continued through Samuel's father's brother, who moved to California after the tragedy. "I'm the family genealogist, and I've spent years trying to piece together what happened to Samuel. Your book finally gave us the closure we never knew we needed." The elderly woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. This belonged to Samuel's mother, Mary. She wrote in it every day until she died in 1954. "I thought you might like to see what she wrote about Samuel's death." With trembling hands, Sarah accepted the journal and opened it to the page Dorothy indicated. The entry was dated July 16, 1923, the day after Samuel's drowning. "My precious boy is gone, taken by the waters that swallowed our home. But I don't believe he suffered. Last night I dreamed I saw him playing in Miller's Creek, laughing and splashing just like he used to do. In my dream, our farmhouse was still standing, and Robert was calling us in for supper. I think Samuel found his way home after all, back to the place where he was happiest." Sarah read further and found entries spanning decades, each one a letter to Samuel, updating him on family news, expressing continued love, and gradually moving toward acceptance and peace. Mary Hartwell had never stopped believing that her son's spirit lived on, but unlike Sarah's supernatural encounter, Mary's connection to Samuel had been one of love and letting go rather than desperate clinging. The final entry, written just days before Mary's death, read, "I'm not afraid to join you now, my darling boy. I know you've been waiting, and I know you've learned to be patient. We'll have eternity to make up for the years we lost." "Dorothy," Sarah said quietly, "do you believe Samuel found peace?" The elderly woman looked out over the calm waters of Ozark Lake, her expression serene. "I believe he found what we all hope to find, that love transcends death, that our connections to each other don't end just because our bodies do. Your book showed us that Samuel touched many lives, even after he was gone. That's a kind of immortality, isn't it?" As the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah and Dorothy stood in comfortable silence beside the memorial. Other visitors had left flowers and small mementos, a child's toy boat, a handful of smooth stones from the shore, a wreath of wildflowers picked from the surrounding woods. "Miss Chen," Dorothy said finally, "there's something else I wanted to give you." She pulled out a small photograph, this one showing a different view of the Hartwell farm. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the oak tree with the tire swing that Samuel had described so lovingly in his memories. "This was taken in 1922, a year before the flooding. I thought you might want it for your archives." Sarah accepted the photograph with reverence, understanding that she had become more than just a journalist who had written about Samuel's story. She had become the keeper of his memory, the guardian of his legacy, the living link between past and present. As darkness fell over Ozark Lake, Sarah made a final entry in her own journal. "Today we dedicated a memorial to Samuel Hartwell and all the residents of Cedar Ridge. But the real memorial isn't made of bronze and granite. It's made of memory and story, of the connections we forge across time and death. Samuel's story taught me that the dead are only truly gone when they are forgotten, and that love is the strongest force for keeping memory alive. The boy who appeared in a 1944 photograph has become part of history now, not as a ghost or supernatural phenomenon, but as a reminder that every life matters, that every story deserves to be told, and that sometimes the most important truths can only be seen through the lens of mystery and wonder. Tonight, Ozark Lake is peaceful. The spirits that once haunted its depths have found rest, not through exorcism or banishment, but through acknowledgement and love. Samuel Hartwell is no longer the boy beneath the water. He is the light that shines through dark water, illuminating the stories that connect us all. As Sarah walked back to her car, she could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, but now the sound was comforting rather than ominous. In the distance, she could swear she heard the faint echo of children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, not ghostly or supernatural, but warm and alive and eternal. The boy from the 1944 photograph had finally come home, not to the drowned valley beneath the lake, but to the hearts and memories of all who had heard his story and understood that some bonds transcend the boundary between life and death. Samuel Hartwell would never be forgotten again, and in that remembrance he had found the peace that had eluded him for 8 decades. The lake held many secrets still, but they were no longer secrets of sorrow and loss. They were secrets of love, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find meaning in even the darkest waters of existence. As Sarah drove away from Ozark Lake for the final time, she carried with her not just the memory of a ghostly encounter, but the profound understanding that every person's story matters, that death is not the end of influence, and that sometimes the most important truths can only be discovered by those brave enough to seek out mysteries that others would prefer to leave undisturbed. The photograph that had started it all now rested in the Missouri Historical Society's archives, properly catalogued and preserved for future generations, but its real power lay not in its supernatural origins, but in its ability to remind viewers that behind every mystery is a human story, and behind every ghost is a person who simply wanted to be remembered and loved.